Hi everyone, thank you for joining me. In this talk, I'm going to present a model that focuses on how regulators' incentives for blame avoidance shapes the ways in which they design approval rules for new innovations. One benefit in modeling the private incentives of regulators is that it opens up the paths to studying how we could optimally design the rules of regulatory governance. Consumer protection regulators who are tasked with approving new innovations may not have strong priors over the quality of the products they're approving if they're really novel, and they might not even be able to test for these qualities directly if they're really complex. Now, what makes the job of the regulator even harder is that often the only source of information about an innovation comes from the innovating firm, which might have both the incentives and the capacity to manipulate the evidence that it reports. To give an example, when it comes to checking whether the latest Ford truck model passes their safety standard, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration would just have to put this car through a routine battery of tests to verify this directly. But there are no such procedures in place to check the safety of the first consumer-ready automated vehicle, and the NHTSA would instead have to rely on data from the manufacturing firm to make that decision. Now, despite the difficulty of their task, regulators are often criticized ex post by a variety of third parties on the basis of their decision quality, for example, by politicians, lobbying firms, and patient advocacy groups and consumer protection groups. So, for example, if the FDA ended up approving a drug which turned out to be good, they might get criticized for not having expedited its approval when that could have potentially saved more lives. And if the same drug turns out to be bad, the FDA could get criticized for having rushed its approval or not placed stringent enough production quotas. Now, another dimension on which regulators get routinely criticized is the compliance costs that they create for firms that participate in the approval process. How do regulators with these incentives design approval rules? To answer this question, I consider a model in which the regulator first commits to a rule mapping evidence to a level of approval. The firm then, on the basis of this rule and its own private information, generates a certain level of evidence, and then chooses what of the evidence that it generated to actually report to the regulator. And finally, the regulator realizes her payoffs at a point in time in the future when the quality of her decision becomes public knowledge. The firm runs costly binary outcome trials which result in a success or a failure. And while there are many ways in which the firm might be able to manipulate the evidence that it shares with the regulator, in this talk I'll focus on a firm that can cherry-pick the evidence that it reports and therefore do things like suppress negative trials. The firm has a private multidimensional type theta and some abstract type space omega, and theta determines a lot of properties of the firm, including its distribution of potential innovation qualities, v tilde of theta, its expected payoff if it's approved, b of theta, its cost per trial, k, and its chance of succeeding in each of these trials, q. The regulator, unlike the firm, doesn't know theta, and to emphasize the fact that she's faced with a particularly novel approval decision, will in fact assume she doesn't even have a prior over theta, and therefore faces ambiguity over the agent's type space. Now, the regulator maps evidence to a level of approval, but by the revelation principle, it's going to be equivalent to think of her as offering a menu, y and n, that map types of the firm to a level of approval and the amount of favorable evidence that the firm has to show in order to obtain this level of approval, with the restriction that this menu has to be incentive compatible. I'll use a convention, y equals 1, to mean the regulator is going to approve the firm outright and give it full or immediate approval, whereas y equals 0 means the regulator rejects the firm outright and doesn't revisit this decision until a time in the future where theta gets publicly revealed. And theta might still get revealed even after the regulator rejected the firm, because, for example, the same innovation might get approved in a different jurisdiction, and information about this product might leak out. Now, finally, the regulator can do something in between full approval and rejection by giving a level of partial approval, which you can think of as approval with a production quota, or approval with a restriction to a certain subset of markets, or approval only after a period of delay. The regulator is evaluated by the size of the error that she makes with respect to some benchmark quality v tilde naught. So, for example, she might partially approve a product which turns out to be of lower quality than this benchmark, and in that case she's made a type 1 error. F is some increasing function which governs how her criticism scales with the size of the type 1 error that she makes. Now, the payoffs to the regulator also scale with the amount of approval that she offers the firm, and this is meant to capture the fact that if a product turned out to be bad, the regulator is going to be in much more trouble if she approved that product outright than if she did so after a long period of deliberation or with very high production quotas in place. Now, the regulator is also evaluated on the basis of the type 2 errors that she makes, and the way with which her payoff scale with the size of type 2 errors is given by some increasing function g, which in general can be smaller or slower growing than f to capture the fact that type 2 errors are perhaps less visible than type 1 errors. Finally, the regulator is also evaluated on the basis of the evidence production costs that she creates for the firm that participates in her approval process. The regulator's criticism is an increasing function h of the amount of costly evidence n that the firm ends up generating. Now, in solving the model, it's convenient to represent the regulator's problem in an alternative way, and to that end, Lemma 1 says that minimizing the sum of expected worst-case evaluations for the regulator is equivalent to minimizing regret after a certain change of variables. So you can think of the regulator as solving the following problem. She picks an implementable approval rule y to minimize her max regret, where regret is the sum of two components, compliance costs, which we already talked about before, and a consumer protection error, which is the difference between the payoff to her best action that she could have taken in hindsight, which is either full approval or full rejection, and the action that she ended up taking, which involved some level of partial approval. Now let's turn to a simple example to illustrate the model. Suppose the regulator is deciding whether or not a new automated vehicle is fit for public use. Now AVs, unlike standard cars, need to be driven millions of miles to determine their safety across a range of driving scenarios. So suppose that the firm is asked to report all the trips that it's made and record any incidents which required some level of human intervention in order to override the computer's algorithm, which incidentally is the policy that state regulators in California use, and is precisely one of those situations where you worry about firms underreporting or misclassifying what constitutes a human intervention. Now, to keep things simple in this example, suppose that operational costs of running these trips, which you can think of as fuel economy and the costs of paying drivers, lies in some interval k lower bar and k upper bar, and that the chance of running a successful trip, meaning a trip that doesn't require a human intervention, lies in some interval q lower bar, q upper bar, and that finally regulators are evaluated precisely on this measure of the innovation's quality, its chance of delivering successful trips. And to keep things simple, let's suppose that the benefit of approval is identical across firm types. Here's a picture of the firm's type space. On the x-axis are operational costs, and on the y-axis, there's the probabilities with which the firm's product returns successful trips. The rectangular area boxed in by the dashed lines is the set of possible firm types. Suppose the regulator uses a threshold type approval rule where she gives full or immediate approval if at least n successful trips are shown and rejects the firm otherwise. A rule like this splits the type space into two regions. The set of types in green are those for whom the benefits of approval are greater than the expected costs of producing the requisite evidence to obtain that level of approval. These are the types who participate in the approval process and ultimately obtain full approval. The types in blue, however, are those for whom the costs of running trips are too high or the probability of generating successful trips too low for it to be worthwhile to participate in the regulator's test. These types end up getting no approval at all. Now there's a whole region of blue type agents that sits above this benchmark V0. These are types who ideally the regulator would like to approve but end up not obtaining approval because it's too costly to do so. Now the largest error that the regulator makes is the difference between the highest quality blue type of agent who sits out of the approval process and the benchmark quality V0. By making her test a little bit easier and reducing the number of successful trips that the firm has to show in order to obtain approval, the regulator can reduce the size of the largest possible type 2 error that she can make. But this comes at the cost of now introducing the possibility of certain type 1 errors, since some firm types who have a quality below V0 would now find it worthwhile to participate in the regulatory approval process. Now, the regulator might be interested in using non-threshold type approval rules like the one I have pictured here, where she gives full approval to the green types, no approval to the blue types, and an intermediate level of approval to the types sitting between the two solid black lines. Now, the question is a rule like this one implementable? Meaning, is there a mapping from evidence to approval that screens agents in the way that's pictured here? The answer to this question is yes, and Lemma 2 says that the implementable approval rules are those which offer greater approval to types with a higher benefit of approval to cost of favorable evidence production ratios. It turns out that this ratio pins down the firm's choice in any menu, and so we call this ratio the firm's effective type. Returning to the AV example, we can identify effective types with these rays emanating from the origin. So an approval rule will be implementable as long as it gives more approval to types that are sitting on steeper rays. Now, before thinking about optimal approval rules, let's consider how we can apply this characterization of implementability to rationalize some stylistic features about how regulators behave. In particular, let's consider the case of FDA reviews of new drug applications. Now, these FDA reviews occur only after pharmaceutical companies have completed all 3 stages of clinical trials for a drug. So a first fact is that these FDA review times can exhibit substantial variance. They can take anywhere between a week and more than 3 years. And fact number 2, which we learned from this Carpenter quote, is that these delays are unrelated to information acquisition. They occur after a point in time where the pharmaceutical company has stopped collecting additional evidence. In fact, Carpenter goes on to say that agency design, administrative procedures, or informational barriers will by themselves have difficulty explaining the variance in FDA review times. Now, a third fact, which we learned from a study by Olson in 1997, is that these delays are negatively correlated with a ratio of drug sales to research expenditure, which are precisely the effective types in our model. And this is after controlling for a variety of drug and firm-level characteristics. And meanwhile, Olson finds that the correlation with sales alone or research expenditure alone is insignificant. And these are the correlation patterns that we would expect from our characterization of implementability. So despite the fact that we're abstracting from many of the features in these settings, a simple theory of weak information and blame avoidance can tie together these patterns about variance and correlation in delays that, as Carpenter suggests, other simple explanations fail to properly account for. Now we're ready to discuss regulator optimal approval rules and state some of the main positive findings of this paper. Pictured here on the left is one image of what a firm's type space could look like. On the x-axis, we have the firm's effective type, and on the y-axis, we have for every effective type the range of possible product qualities that the firm might have. Graphed on the right is an arbitrary approval rule y prime, and y prime is implementable because it offers more approval to firms with higher effective types. But the question is, can y prime be an optimal approval rule for the type space that I have pictured to the left? And it turns out that the answer to this question is no, and the reason we can tell that right off the bat is because y prime gives 0 approval to a firm of the lowest effective type tau lower bar. Now at first brush, this seems like a reasonable thing to do, because if we looked at the picture of the firm's type space, firms with the lowest effective type, or close to the lowest effective type, have a range of qualities that lies below V0. So if we knew the firm's effective type ex ante and didn't have to screen it out, we could safely avoid the possibility of making any errors with these firms by rejecting them outright. But recall that at the time when the regulator commits to an approval rule, she doesn't know whether she's going to be facing a low effective type or a high effective type, but instead worries about the worst case realization of the firm's type and evaluates outcomes according to their max regret, which is the sum of both these consumer protection errors that we've been talking about so far in our examples, but also the compliance costs that the firms incur by generating costly evidence in this approval process. So if we move from an approval rule like y prime to a rule like y double prime, which involves giving away some level of approval for free to even the lowest effective type, we certainly introduce the possibility of making larger type 1 errors for these low effective types, but at the same time, we also reduce the burden of additional evidence that these higher effective types have to show in order to obtain the same level of approval as they were before. And so we reduce their compliance costs by making it easier for them to separate from lower effective types. And so y double prime might end up achieving a lower worst case regret than y prime. In fact, Proposition 2 tells us that optimal rules always partially approve firms even when they show no evidence, and we can think of this as an incentives-based explanation for why regulators create sandboxes that might allow firms to monetize on their innovations in a limited market without showing any prior evidence of safety or quality or efficacy, which is an increasingly common mode of regulating financial innovations, for example. And this incentive story suggests that regulators would be keen on deploying sandboxes even when their ability to monitor and learn about a product is limited, both so that they can reduce the risk of making large mistakes and so that they can make approval costs less burdensome for the regulated industry. With an additional richness assumption about the firm's type space and a co-monotonicity assumption about the regulator's evaluation criterion and the firm's benefits, we can extend the logic of Proposition 2 to show that an optimal rule Y star will look the way it's pictured in the graph on the left. Y star front-loads all increases in approval to a set of lowest effective types and then offers a constant level of approval afterwards. And on the region where approval is increasing, the regulator's worst-case error is going to be of type 1. It's going to be constant on this region and as large as possible, and all of this is in service of making the highest effective type have a small type 2 error without having to show too much evidence to secure this high level of approval. Again, due to the regulator's concern for compliance costs, optimal rules might also feature strict precaution, by which I mean the regulator precludes the option of obtaining full and immediate approval no matter how much evidence the firm is willing to show. And this might happen even if sufficiently high effective types are guaranteed to be better than the regulator's benchmark quality V0. So while it might frustrate public interest, regulators might find it useful to drag their feet on approval decisions even when an innovation appears to be obviously better than some status quo technology. To recap, in this talk I discussed some features of approval processes that can be explained as being deliberate choices made by regulators who have limited information and experience in making certain decisions and are simply trying to avoid blame. And this theory can rationalize why regulators might delay approval even when they don't intend to collect additional information and learn more about a product, why delays are correlated with certain firm cost and revenue characteristics, and finally, why regulators might be keen both on creating sandboxes and simultaneously restricting the option of full approval. Now, this talk focused on the positive aspects of regulatory behavior, but this kind of theory can be useful in addressing the question of how we should regulate the regulator. And we can consider a model in which the politician or social planner delegates approval decisions to the regulator, and in this model, the regulator wouldn't have an informational advantage over the principal because she faces ambiguity over the firm's type space herself, but she can still be an expert in the sense that she knows how to interpret the evidence that the firm presents, whereas the politician does not. And so the principal might find it optimal to allow the regulator to make approval decisions on his behalf, but at the same time might also restrict the regulator's action space if he cares more or less about the firm's compliance costs than the regulator does. So if you're interested in this issue of regulatory governance, I'd encourage you to take a look at the paper. Thank you for listening.